Thank you again for joining our session today. We've got people spread over lots of different time zones, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So this session today is on PEO versus payroll. We're going to try and give it the most unbiased opinion we can, and make our suggestions of obviously what is right for you and what sort of things you need to look out for. So there are a few familiar faces on here. So what we will be doing is throughout this session running polls. This is useful for us and also to gather information so we can actually try and tweak our sessions moving forward to suit our audience a bit better. So please feel free to engage, ask questions, click the buttons that kind of pop up on the polls that we suggest. So if we could move on to the first slide and do some introductions on us. So for the people that don't know UnaTerra and what we do, we provide in essence business critical services all over the world, and that can be anything from payroll, accountancy, tax, and HR services for companies that, generally speaking, are expanding or have expanded into new territories and are just unsure how to do things. So background on me, I'm actually a recent joiner to UnaTerra, having worked in the space for 4 or 5 years previously, and worked in a commercial capacity growing other businesses and setting out the commercial infrastructure. But I have a real passion for people and HR and how to look after employees as you expand and building the right culture. So hopefully I can have a valuable input in today. A colleague of mine and co-founder Julian is also our expert for today. So I'll let Julian do a bit of background on himself.
Thanks, James. Much appreciated. Hi, everybody. So just following on from James's intro, I'm Julian Christmas. I'm one of the founders of UnaTerra. Been working in this international expansion, international hiring field for a long time, and got some great experience working with some, as we can see from the slide there, some big ticket projects of note, working with Airbnb and Tesla Motors in the early days of their international expansion. But I also have been involved in dealing with very small and advising on very small expansions, single person expansions for companies with as few as 2 people all the way up to publicly listed and quite large organizations. So been doing this a long time, and yeah, been working with UnaTerra since its foundation about 7 years ago.
So before we actually kind of jump into the technical pieces of our slides for today, I think probably it's worth addressing why we're looking at this. So the PEO or EOR space is a very busy market, and it's seeing a lot of investment, and we have a lot of inquiries coming through our door of people saying, I've actually just spoken to X company. I didn't realize that it was a third-party arrangement and we don't completely understand it. So what we're trying to do is just give a bit more visibility on the pros or cons or the differences between the sorts of solutions of a PEO or employee of record solution, and that in itself is a third-party arrangement or a direct employment solution that UnaTerra can offer. Obviously, through our partnership networks, we do work with PEO providers, and there very much is a time and place for that sort of solution. So we're not here to say anything against it, just look at obviously the options that are out there and available to you all. So I will pass over to Julian as our expert to start delving into a bit more detail on today's slides.
Excellent. Let's go to the next slide. So just very quick, and this will be very quick, but literally in case, I think it makes sense to set out and explain and give everybody a full understanding of exactly what we're referring to when we're talking about PEO or EOR or GEO. There are a number of expressions for it, but they're all the same thing. So quick definitions. So PEO is professional employer organization, but on the international front, that's the same as an EOR, which is employer of record, or a GEO, which I think is a global employer organization. In essence, they're all the same thing. We will just refer to them all as PEO. So when we refer to PEO, you may recognize EOR or GEO, but in essence, we're kind of referring to all of those as the same thing. So PEO. And the concept of PEO, just for clarity, it's a way of hiring people in a country where your business doesn't have any presence or any sort of footprint in terms of either legal entity or even tax registrations or anything else. Your business will identify talent, so you'll find somebody in another country that you want to hire, and you will use a PEO provider in order to regularize the employment of that person. So you will use the services of that third party. Your business will not contract with the employee, but they'll contract with the third party or representative of the third party. Sometimes it's not a direct relationship that you have with the PEO provider. And they will engage in an employment relationship with the individual that you're hiring. So in essence, it's an outsourced hiring arrangement. What it does is it gives full compliance with local HR and employment law, and that's really the key behind the whole thing, is that you have immediate access to a solution which gives full compliance with employment law. It's a critical thing, particularly anywhere outside of the US. It's much more significant than it is in the US. It's super quick, so as well as being compliant, it's very quick. It typically takes a few days. So if you're looking to hire somebody and have them on board next week, then usually the only way to achieve that quickly is to do it through a PEO service provider. So it's very quick in terms of identifying the solution and onboarding the employee. And it's very helpful in particularly complex markets where, you know, in some European countries, it's quite easy to hire and onboard employees as an employee in a few weeks. You know, it could be 4 weeks or 3 weeks. In China or Brazil, for 3 or 4 weeks, read 15 or 20 weeks, you need a legal entity. It takes a very long time. Some of these markets are very, very complex. And if you want to hire somebody, even if you're not in a great hurry, PEO can be a great solution because it cuts through a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the work that needs to go into hiring somebody locally. So great for very complex markets. So that's PEO. It's essentially hiring through a third party. We go to the next slide now. So in our world of international expansion, direct payroll or direct hiring is the alternative to PEO. And rather than outsourcing that employment relationship, what we refer to as payrolling is really engaging in a direct employment relationship with that hire. So your company, your business hires them directly, enters into the employment relationship. So your business critically owns the relationship with the employee. It also allows for compliance with employment law, but it also allows compliance with lots of other laws, and we'll cover that later in the webinar. It's compliant in many ways that the PEO sometimes isn't. It can be quick, but not always. So in some countries, it's quite easy to payroll, as I said, people in a few short weeks, but there are some fairly significant exceptions to that. And critically as well, in terms, as well as owning the employment relationship, your business can also control the onboarding relationship. Onboarding of the employee, of course, is their first real experience of working with you and your business, and to be able to control that and to control the experience for the employee is really an important part of their journey with your business. So that's direct payrolling or direct employment as opposed to PEO or that sort of outsourcing arrangement. We can just go to the next slide. We're just going to run. So I think we've got 4 or 5 polls, and the first one is a quick one, helpful for us to understand of the attendees on the call, really, whether your businesses engage international talent through a payrolling solution or a PEO solution, or whether you use both. And if everyone can just take a few seconds to answer that, it'd be really interesting to see. And as the results are coming in, it looks like a really interesting mix, and that's not totally unexpected. Let's say because PEO is often used in more complex international markets. Yep. So we get thanks. Looks like most people have put in their responses, and it's really a mixed bag. A lot of companies are using payroll. That can often be where there are employees in only a small number of countries. I just got off a call prior to this webinar with a business who have employees in 30 countries on PEO arrangements, and it's super complicated. So interesting then. Thank you for your responses there. A mixed response and people using all different combinations. So in terms of the things to think about, if you're hiring in other countries and you're looking to onboard employees, what are the factors which are going to determine whether PEO or direct payrolling is the right solution for you? There's no right or wrong answer. It's a graded thing, so there are various factors to consider, and what we've done here is really look at which solution is more favourable according to the factors that we're looking at. From a time frame perspective, I think it's safe to say that there are no countries where payrolling is going to be quicker than the PEO solution. PEO generally takes a few days, and payroll can seldom be achieved that quickly. So we always say that PEO is going to be quicker. In terms of cost, we've ticked both sides because the answer is it depends. It depends on everything from particularly which country you're looking at through to what you're going to pay the employee. There are various how many employees there are going to be in that particular market. As you increase the headcount, the cost tends to favor payroll, but on a single headcount in one country, PEO can be more competitive in say China, whereas payroll will definitely be more competitive in most European countries. So cost, it depends. Company culture, Andrew, James, apologies. I wonder if I could just ask you to just talk a bit about culture and extension of culture out to the employee base.
Yeah, so culture is an interesting one. So I think if you go all the way back to the grassroots of why a PEO or payroll solutions being introduced, whether it's through accessing new markets from hiring new talent, the talent that you're looking at getting will generally speaking be probably someone that's already operating in your markets. So generally speaking, finding good talent is quite difficult at the moment. So what you'll be looking at doing is trying to find someone that's probably in a similar environment to the business that you're operating in these new markets, and trying to cultivate a good culture with that will be one reason to attract that talent. One of the bits of feedback that we've had from people using third-party setups has been, how does the employee feel when they're not employed directly by X company and they're employed by a third party? So there's the kind of, with PEO setups, and there's lots of different providers and they have lots of different ways of working it. So I have to be quite generous in the way that I speak, but the benefit offerings can be quite attractive from a benefits perspective. So what these companies do is they employ tens, 50, hundreds of people under their entities within those countries, and they have access to certain benefits. Those benefits are caveated as what's available to those individuals. If you are employing the employee directly, you can have any policy, any wording that you want in the employment contracts, any benefits that you want to offer over and above. There might be slightly different options. It might not necessarily be a group scheme. It might be an individually written scheme. All those sort of things do create a culture. So when we talk about culture within businesses, it's trying to keep the employees engaged when they're working with you and feel like there's a one organization. Remote working is a real challenge. So I personally feel the payroll element with the direct employment, making a one sort of culture definitely works within this sort of arrangement.
Thanks, James.
And I think that obviously does come into the scalability bit, Julian, if you want to touch on how the scalability works.
Yeah, it does. And from a scalability perspective, I think really the scalability kind of folds into cost, but also, as you mentioned, benefits and other parts of the jigsaw. Scalability in the sense that from a cost perspective, one person in any country, the cost differential isn't likely to be that material. 5 people, it could be quite balanced, or it could go heavily in favor of payroll. If you can have 20 or 30 people in any country, then it's highly unlikely that PEO is going to work from a cost perspective. I think you would consider it to be scalable, just because costs can spiral if you have that many people running on a per head PEO type of solution. So scalability point is really about that. But you're right, James, it does take into, it does fold in as well things like the ability to access benefit schemes and certainly competitively priced benefit schemes as part of that scalability. There's a compliance angle as well, and the PEO does give compliance. It really gives payroll compliance and employment law compliance, which can be enough depending on the circumstances, but there are various other things to consider from compliance perspective, and payrolling arrangements can come in many shapes and forms, but you always have the opportunity to be compliant. So for example, stock option compliance can be awkward or impossible through PEO arrangements, whereas payrolling always allows a company to be fully compliant from the point of view of stock option reporting and taxing of gains and so on. There are some other matters that will actually come up on the next slide, which is the risk control slide, but a lot of that is relating to compliance. Convenience is a key thing. It's sort of a combination of some of the other factors, but PEO is just very convenient because it's so immediate, and you're essentially outsourcing the onboarding process, the employment contract. It is very convenient, but obviously, we take it. I think James said in the intro that our intention is to give a fully balanced view between PEO and payroll. We're not in the habit of overselling payroll and trying to make PEO look bad. We totally accept it's a great solution, and one of its main attractions is its convenience. And there's a final point around risk control and you and your business's ability to control certain types of risk. We'll visit that on the next slide. I think we've got another quick poll to run at the moment, which is about the factors that you as employers think are most important when it comes to hiring and choosing a hiring solution. So we've picked the three key ones there, really, just to try and understand whether you as hirers and people managers are most driven by cost or onboarding time or employee experience. And it'd be just interesting to see, simply because my expectation is that employee experience is often very important. And if I had to share my thoughts on it, sometimes it's those that think the employee experience is most important are the ones who aren't able to influence the decision. So we often have situations where the employees don't get a great experience, but that's because the decision has been made by somebody who is driven by some of the other factors, typically, for example, cost. Yeah, and no surprise that the majority of answers are that employee experience is really the factor that drives the selection of hiring solution. So thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Just before, Julian, you jump into risks, I think it's worth just kind of speaking about this. So I had a conversation earlier in the week with a external tax consultant, and just to get their feedback on subjects to talk about on this, and to kind of go through a bit of a kind of outsider's opinion on what to look out for when going to market and looking at either a PEO or payroll provider. And she did this exercise for quite a big company, and her feedback really was cheap. And I'm pleased to see that cost wasn't the main motivator on this, but cheap generally isn't always the best. Any advice that she would give to someone that's going to market to look at a solution is to basically present them with problems and see how those sort of things would be handled. So whether it's how would you handle holiday, how would you handle benefits? Because generally speaking, people, and I'm not necessarily speaking for the people on this call, but when people are looking at a solution, they don't know what they don't know. So unfortunately, there are situations where people do end up engaging with a provider for a service that they haven't delved into deep enough. And with that does come quite a lot of risks. So I think Julian will touch on risk in a bit more detail now.
Indeed. Thank you, James. So the risk factors that I referred to in the previous slide, and this is just an expansion of that point, is what are the risks that you need to consider when choosing how to hire people in other countries? And these are some key ones. So permanent establishment is something that I talk about in my work, and James talks about very regularly in his work. And it's often a key, not a key factor, but it's always a factor when it comes to what mechanisms are used to hire people in other countries. And we have got another, but apologies for throwing another poll so quickly, but it's really helpful to understand. We've got a quick poll which simply asks the extent to which you feel like you understand the concept of permanent establishment. So I'd love it if everybody could just quickly say yes, no, or no, need more information. As I say, it's something that I talk about literally every day. And the people that I speak to are variously very sophisticated in their understanding of it, or don't understand the concept at all, or somewhere in between. So it's interesting to see the result is basically more or less split evenly between yes and no. So what I'll do, we'll be happy to provide some follow-up information. Actually, what I might do is reach out to anybody after the webinar, anybody who's answered no, need more information, just try and provide a bit more information on that. In essence, I'll give a very quick snapshot though. So the concept of permanent establishment and permanent establishment risk is really the risk that your business engages in some activity in a country in such a way that inadvertently oversteps a nexus and exposes the company to some sort of it's really generally a tax exposure. So triggering an exposure, for example, to corporate tax, potentially VAT, but corporate tax is the main one. And so, you know, a good example is if you hire somebody in another country and they're a very senior salesperson, but you put them either on just a simple payroll or a PEO, but without a legal entity, the fact that that person is selling and engaging in commercial activity in that country is exposing your business to permanent establishment risk, in that their activity could be deemed to trigger an exposure to corporate tax in that country. And it's not controlled because you don't have a legal entity. So that's why it's a risk and not a simple factor of permanent establishment. So anyway, I won't go on about it too much, but permanent establishment is a key thing to consider when contemplating what's a good solution for hiring a particular type of person in a particular country. PEO legislation is a little bit sort of hypothetical, but some countries are starting to legislate in the area of PEO. Germany's a well-known example where Germany's legislation allows individuals only to be hired through a PEO arrangement for a maximum of 18 months. So that's not really likely to influence a decision at the date of hiring, but what it does do is it puts a finite time period on the ability to hire somebody in Germany on that model before thinking about going with a direct payrolling model. There aren't many examples, but PEO is still relatively in its infancy, and general thought is that there is likely to be more legislation coming into play. But at the moment, Germany is a good example, but it's probably the only example. Tax compliance, I mentioned before about, for example, tax compliance and general kind of company compliance around, for example, stock options, but also corporate taxes and VAT. So there are some risks around your company's exposure to those and your ability to be compliant and control the risk. And the final point, James, if you wouldn't mind picking up the point on employee resistance, which is something that we hear about fairly frequently.
Yeah, just conscious of time, just seeing the time ticking away. If we do, and if it's okay with you, Julian, to skip the next slide, but do the poll and then just wrap up on the last slide. Third to last slide, there with the last bits, just because of timings. But we touched on the employee onboarding piece when it comes to hiring. There will be some employee resistance when it comes to working through that third party without feeling connected to the business. And with that, it has shown that people don't tend to stick too long in their jobs, where all the surveys are slightly tainted and you can skew them to suit whatever argument you want to have. But generally speaking, it tends to be a year to a year and a half is kind of maximum that you'll get through a third party arrangement. There are others that have been within the US, because it's a very known exercise within the US markets, that have been on PEO arrangements forever. But from a foreign markets perspective, it does generally speaking mean that staff retention is compromised slightly. So in the next slide, if we just skip forward, so Julian, if you just want to kind of really high level, I think we've got a poll on the employment law piece. The question we'd really ask on that, if we could pop up the poll, is where the engagement with the employees is done via the third party through a PEO setup. What does tend to happen is that there is an employment agreement or employment engagement that's handled by that provider, but any employee relations issues are thrown back to the client. It will be interesting to see that people that are using, so we had a fair split with it payroll to PEO. Be interesting to know whether actually people have that internal capability or whether there is a market for the standalone employment law services and global markets. And then, yeah, if I just pass back to you, Julian, and to move on to...
Yeah, I'll do 20 seconds on this slide, just very quickly, really looking at compliance and your company's ability to be compliant. What do you get with each solution? Critically, PEO gives you compliance with employment law and payrolling law, of course, as well. Payroll gives you that too, but it also gives you ability to address all these other areas. So it gives you the ability to address and deal with your own permanent establishment risk. It allows you to be compliant from a stock options perspective. It allows you to be compliant from a transfer pricing perspective, which is linked to the permanent establishment point. And finally, visa sponsorship. If you want to sponsor visas and move people between countries, it's very difficult to do that. It is technically possible in some countries to do it under a PEO arrangement, but usually you need your own legal entity as a starting point for doing that. So that was the compliance one, and then so if we can just move to the final slide, really sort of in conclusion and conscious of the time, James, as you said, you know, the title of the webinar is, you know, PEO versus payroll, what's right for you, and really this slide captures you know, the key things to consider in terms of, you know, what's important to you as an employer, what's important to your business. James, you might want to take the first two very quickly, the employee experience and culture. They relate back to what you were talking about previously.
Yeah, so as I say, this is only from feedback and what we see in the market, but generally speaking, the first two tend to sit quite nicely with payroll and the direct employment setup, because you own the relationship with the employee. And then to jump down to the bottom, or to the complexity of markets, has an impact with the culture and the employee experience, because there's certain things that longer term wise that you can roll out as you grow with that, and so that suits the compliance piece as well. Sorry to keep pushing on time, Julian, just conscious that we are at our deadline for 30 minutes.
Sure. Okay. We can probably overflow for a couple of minutes. I don't know, James, if we had any questions in, and if anyone needs to drop off course to other appointments, I'm sure they'll do that. But if we have any questions, we can field those.
Yes, we have had a few. I think from just reading through, a handful of them will come back offline and reach back out to you directly. There's one that is asking, and Julian, you can pick this up, are there any better or worse countries to provide PEO services in?
Better or worse countries? I would interpret that to mean, are there any countries where PEO lends itself more as the favoured solution rather than pay? I think that's what that means. And the answer is, we would always present PEO as the better option in low headcount, complex market situations. So, you know, it's not great to generalize, but if you're hiring one or two people in any South American country, in any more or less any African country, Middle Eastern countries too, where the setup and hiring process is very complex. There and in China, these are all areas where PEO is generally going to be the better solution, just due to the complexity and time taken to be able to onboard employees. In Europe, it can depend, but if you have the luxury of a few weeks of time, then I would generally say that direct payrolling is a better solution. Almost without exception, it's possible to hire and payroll in Europe, in all European countries, without creating a legal entity. And I think that's an important thing to understand, because it's a common misconception that you need a legal entity in a country to hire employees. Almost exclusively throughout Europe, that is not the case. It's possible to be very compliant and hire and payroll employees without a legal entity. And in fact, that's a lot of the work that UnaTerra does. There are various other markets where that's possible, notably from the point of view of the work that we do. Canada, Australia are key ones where we do a lot of hiring and where we don't need to create legal entities for our clients. So really, it depends on critically the complexity of the market. Hopefully, that kind of answers it in a roundabout sort of way.
Yeah, we have had just another question come in, which I won't answer, but I will come back to you. But it's actually one that opens up a load of questions about transferring from a PEO to a payroll service once obviously the confidence is built up in those markets. It's something that we can advise on and help with, and it's very common because the cost associated to the ongoing PEO solution can sometimes outweigh actually establishing everything over a long period of time. So we do see a lot of that, and as I say, I will come back to you on that. It would be handy to the person that's just put that question in to know the country that you're referring to, so we can obviously come back to you on that. But going through some of the polls and the responses that have come through, I think for the next session, we'll do as a subject the challenges for HR when it comes to PEO and payroll solutions, but mainly focusing on the PEO setup there of how to handle, because there was quite a few responses to the no in that aspect. So yeah, so following this, we'll send out an update and come back to you on any questions that were raised. And send you the updated schedule for the coming weeks for the next webinar. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for all attending. Hopefully it's been useful. Please feel free to reach out to Julian and I if you want to talk about anything. Obviously work related mainly, but anything. We're quite nice people. Julian, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully that was, it was by design, very quick, high level, but hopefully informative in terms of defining PEO, defining payroll, and providing some thoughts about which might be the best fit for your business and any future hires that you might make. Everybody, as James said, please do feel free to reach out and get in touch. A large part of what we do is advising and guiding our clients through the hiring process and recommending solutions according to our clients' appetite for risk versus appetite for cost and various other things. So very front and center to the work that we do.
Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Bye.